In many parts of Nigeria, tradition is not just a way of life, it is law. Among the Efik and Anang people of Akwa Ibom State, a man who impregnates a woman without paying her bride price is considered dishonorable. If she dies before he fulfills his obligation, he must marry her corpse before she can be laid to rest. If he refuses, misfortune will follow him and her spirit will never rest. If he had heard of such customs, but they had always seemed like myths, stories meant to frighten men into following traditions, he never imagined he would one day be at the center of it all. Efe, an indigene of Delta State, was a bus conductor in Lagos, navigating the chaos of the city's streets daily. He was calm, gentle, and loving, but he had a terrible flaw: procrastination. Life in Lagos was tough, and marriage was the last thing on his mind. He met Eno on one of her trips from Mile 12 Market. She was a beautiful and hardworking food vendor with a lively spirit. Despite coming from a strict Efik traditional family, she fell in love with Efe's charm. They became inseparable, living together as husband and wife, though no formal marriage rite had been performed. Eno's family disapproved. Her uncles, custodians of the village shrine, repeatedly sent messages warning Efe to pay her bride price. One evening, two of her uncles, Chief Edet and Okon, traveled all the way to Lagos to confront him. "Young man," Chief Edet began sternly, "you have been living with our daughter as though she was your wife. Yet, you have not followed the customs." Efe shifted uncomfortably. "Chief, things are hard. I need more time." "Time?" Okon scoffed. "You have taken her as a wife in your house. In our land, a woman cannot be a man's wife in life and a stranger in death." Eno pleaded with him. "Efe, please, let's do the right thing." But Efe waved it off. "Next year," he promised. "Money no dey now." Months passed and Eno became pregnant. She was ecstatic, but the warnings from her family continued. Her mother was deeply worried. Then came the fateful night. Eno woke up in the middle of the night, clutching her stomach. Sweat dripped from her forehead and she gasped in pain. Efe sprang up from the bed, panic gripping his chest. "Eno, what is wrong?" Eno responded in pain. "I don't know. The pain, it is too much," she whispered, her voice trembling. Efe's hands shook as he grabbed his phone. The nearest hospital was a short distance away, but Lagos at midnight was a nightmare. Traffic, unavailability of taxis, and the heavy rainstorm that had begun moments ago made the situation even more terrifying. Efe carried Eno in his arms, running barefoot through the flooded streets, waving desperately at passing cars. No one stopped. The rain pounded against his back as he screamed for help. By the time they reached the hospital, Eno's breathing had become shallow. Her fingers, once so full of life, felt cold in his grasp. The nurses rushed her into the maternity ward, leaving Efe alone in the waiting area, drenched, shaking, and praying. Hours passed. The silence was unbearable. Then the doctor emerged, his face grim. "I am sorry," he said. "We did our best, but she did not make it." The words hit Efe like a sledgehammer to his chest. His knees buckled and he collapsed on a bench. The room spun. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His entire world had just shattered. Then the doctor added, "The baby didn't survive either." Efe let out a strangled cry. It felt like someone had plunged a knife into his heart and twisted it. His vision blurred as hot tears streamed down his face. He had lost everything in one night. But this was the beginning of his nightmare. Efe traveled to Akwa Ibom for the burial, expecting a simple funeral. Instead, he was met with hostility. The air was thick with tension. Her uncles, elders, and kinsmen stood firm. "You cannot bury her until you marry her," her eldest uncle declared. "Tradition must be honored." Efe was confused. "But she is gone. What is the need for bride price now?" Chief Edet's expression was cold. "You took her as a wife in life. You must make it right in death. If you refuse, her spirit will haunt you and you will die mysteriously." Efe's heart pounded. This is madness. But deep down, fear crept in. His worst horror came next. "You must sleep in the same room with her corpse for 7 nights, the elders pronounced. Efe felt his world collapsed. His chest tightened. The mere thought that his skin crawled. He wanted to run, but where would he go? The village had spoken. That night, Ife was led into a dimly lit room. There, on a wooden table, lay Enos' lifeless body, wrapped in a white cloth. Her skin had turned pale, her once beautiful face now frozen in an expression of sorrow. The door shut behind him. The room was suffocating. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and frantic. His breath came in rage gasps. He wanted to close his eyes, to pretend this wasn't real, but he could feel her presence. He was not alone in the room. Then the nightmares began. In his dream, Enos stood at the foot of the bed, her white wrapper stained with blood. Her eyes were hollow, filled with sorrow and something else. Anger. "Why didn't you marry me?" she whispered, her voice airy calm. Ife jolted awake, drenched in sweat. The room was deadly silent, but something was wrong. The air felt thick, pressing down on him. Then he heard it, a faint rustling sound. His eyes darted to the table. The white cloth had shifted. His breath caught. He was paralyzed. He wanted to scream, but his voice was wrapped in his throat. He watched in horror as the cloth moved again, slow, deliberate. He scrambled backward, pressing himself against the wooden walls, his fingers clawing at the rough surface. His body trembled violently. The scent of incense mixed with something rotten filled his nostrils. The next night was worse. This time, Enoch cried. Her voice echoed in his head, her sobs growing louder and more painful. By the fourth night, she was screaming, and by the fifth, he could hear whispers even when he was awake. His reflection in the mirror showed him something that wasn't him. His eyes were sunken, his face gaunt, his lips cracked from dehydration. He was losing his mind. By the sixth night, Ife was broken. His mind was unraveling. He hadn't eaten, barely slept. The weight of regret crushed him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Enos' lifeless face, her ghost whispering in his ears. His mother arrived on the seventh day. She wept bitterly, holding on to him. "My son, this is why we tell young men to do the right thing early. See where your procrastination has led you." "I never meant for this to happen," he cried. "I loved her. I just thought I had more time." But time had run out. Overwhelmed, he called his family, begging them to help raise the bride price. The amount had doubled. Death had made the price steeper. On the seventh day, the full dowry was paid. Only then did the elders allow Enos' body to be buried. Ife stood by the graveside, his face soaked with tears. He watched as the final handful of earth covered her grave, each scoop of soil feeling like another stab to his heart. His hands trembled, his knees weak. He wanted to scream, to take back time, to change fate, but it was too late. Ife left the village immediately after the burial, vowing never to make the same mistake again. Never would he get another woman pregnant without marrying her first. That night, back in Lagos, Ife had one final dream. Eno appeared before him, but this time, she was smiling. She looked peaceful, radiant and free. She reached out her hand as if to touch him, but stopped. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice like a gentle wind. "I can rest now." She waved at him, her lips curving into a gentle smile before she vanished into the light. Ife woke up with tears in his eyes. The weight on his chest had lifted, but the pain of loss would never leave him. He had learned his lesson in the cruelest way possible, but was redemption enough to heal a broken heart?